Did you ever wonder why Christ had to die? Why didn't God just say you're forgiven and move on?
Ever wonder why Christ had to die? Like, why didn't God just say you're forgiven and move on?
That's my line. You read the wrong line. We rehearsed for this. Get it right. So yeah, anyway, this is a video about trying to make the sacrifice of Jesus make any sense at all, which is definitely a challenge, but hey, maybe it can be done.
And how does it make sense for justice to be satisfied by somebody else, especially God the Son taking the hit for us? It seems a little bit odd, right?
Well, I guess, but that's not really the main issue, is it? The main issue is if God wanted to do something, why would he choose to do it in such a bizarre and convoluted way? If God's omnipotent, none of this screw-around nonsense is necessary. God doesn't have to operate through processes, especially not temporal ones. His will can simply be done. Remember, the title of the video doesn't just say, why did Jesus die? It says, why Jesus had to die. As in, it was the only option. It had to happen that way. And by even suggesting that there was no other option for God, you're putting extreme limits on your God and revoking his omnipotence.
Well, it's actually a lot deeper than you might think.
I've heard that said many, many times, but nobody's ever explained it to me in a way that actually sounded deep. They usually go for this kind of shallow, surface-level gospel storytelling stuff with some apologetic excuse-making piled on top, and then act like that just is some kind of deep, meaningful thing. I guess because they said it, and they believe it, and they take it real serious, and therefore that's supposed to make it somehow more insightful or multi-layered. People who've watched a lot of my videos know what I'm talking about. We've seen this a lot. When people try to address this concern, there's never really much to it, other than just repeating the basic story of the religion. But maybe this one will be different, by some miracle.
Salvation isn't just some cosmic get-out-of-jail-free card. It's all about union with God.
Okay, that's cool and all, but the point isn't salvation or what that is. The point is, why was God faced with the requirement of this bizarre performance he went through? That's the issue. Everything else is something else.
Think about it.
Why? What does it have to do with the topic?
Jesus didn't just die to help us dodge punishment. He came so we could actually share in God's life.
All right. So what's with trying to make your whole video in the form of memes? Is this some sad attempt to connect with the youth or something? The modern version of the Jesus Christ is my guy? Or any of the other countless iterations over the years of some random dorky Christian guy trying to seem cool, to market better to the teens? You know, as a person who finds memes tolerable, this video's way overboard. This is so irritating to watch. It's like this the entire time. At least switch it up once in a while.
You know the vine and branches analogy in John 15?
I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. Blah, blah, blah. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Which again is kind of bizarre. Why would a Jesus vine have failed branches? Especially since he says that being connected to him makes you bear fruit. In the metaphor, you as the branch are connected to Jesus, and then God the Father comes along to snip your branch off the vine, to forcibly remove you against your will, with you having no control over the process. You want to remain connected, and God says, nah, you're not bearing fruit, go away. Well, if the rules are that you remain in him and he remains in you, and then the branch bears fruit, if you weren't bearing fruit, despite having remained in him, despite your branch remaining attached to the vine before it was removed, the problem here is the failure of the only other requirement, of him remaining in you. In other words, this means that God decided that you weren't going to bear fruit, because he wasn't going to remain in you. Maybe in the metaphor, this would be the vine not bothering to feed the branch, and then because by his choice you didn't bear fruit, he cuts you off the branch, then picks you up, throws you in the fire, and burns you, metaphorically or otherwise. Very nice.
Being connected to Christ gives us life.
What is life in the metaphor? The fruit? Or just being attached to the plant? Those are the only two things mentioned. Well, it's obviously not the fruit. That's not what the fruit is intended to represent. So it's the connection to the plant, which you can't sever. You're a branch. God unilaterally severs that connection. He snips you off. And if this is supposed to be a description of how you end up in hell, which it sure sounds like, this very much goes against the Christians who say you send yourself there.
But here's the kicker. Before Jesus, we couldn't share in God's life.
Okay, why? I mean, you say we couldn't, but you don't really mean it was impossible, right? Because God could have made it possible. So what you mean is that God chose to prevent it. He configured reality in such a way as to make it impossible for us, by any effort that we put in, regardless of what it was, to access this. But of course, being the controller of all reality, he could have changed that at any moment he wished. It wouldn't have required any sort of event in the world. God's not subject to conditions within the creation. Whether some pageant has or hasn't gone on in the Middle East has nothing to do with anything.
We were just too alien, too different. Like trying to graft an apple branch onto a horse. It just doesn't work.
Okay, so make humans not aliens. It's the omnipotent God's own creation that he tried to make in his own image. And he made them into alien beings as different from him as an apple is from a horse. Why? Is there a why? Well, no. I'm just supposed to accept you saying this as if it explains something. This doesn't explain anything. This doesn't answer a single question. It just raises more. Also, are you trying to imply to me that God could not graft an apple branch onto a horse if he wanted to?
But Jesus came and bridged that gap by becoming human, experiencing what we experience. Pain, fear, death.
Are you trying to tell me then that the issue was not with us? The issue was with God not understanding what it's like to be us in his omniscience? And then he became Jesus, the dev spawned himself into the game, and he messed around in there for a while, and then he was like, wow, it's crazy being in this game. I had no idea. Here I was refusing to connect with these weird aliens I found who aren't made in my image at all, tossing them into hell because they were so weird I didn't want to graft them onto me to share my life with them. But boy, was I ignorant. I sure wish this was included in the everything I previously knew, from my timeless perspective. I guess that chronologically forward from this point in time, I'll give people an option to connect with me. Only an option, of course. I have to make sure the connection only works if they believe in me, too. Yeah, the problem was on my end with me not understanding them in my omniscience, so this really should have actually fixed the problem for everyone, but I don't wanna. No, only an option, and they should be happy with that, damn it. And only for the people who come after the incarnation chronologically. I could do that for the past ones, too, cause time doesn't matter to me at all, but nah. For some reason, time matters to me in this particular case. I guess I could move my incarnation to the start of time. I mean, I can do that if I want, but nah, those first couple thousand years, not important. That's fine.
And then turning around and creating something entirely new.
The Creator God creating new stuff? No way.
A life that's both human and divine. Through him, we're saved and brought into union with God.
Yeah, okay, so again, the topic of the video is why? Why this? Why necessarily this? Specifically this? Only, as opposed to anything else. Like, yes, we know the story. Everyone's been pestered with it for plenty enough centuries. But why would a god have no choice but to implement that and only that story? It makes no sense, and you should be explaining why it does make sense that it had to be that way, but instead you're just telling the story again. Which, let's face it, everybody kind of knew you were going to. I think a lot of the time when Christians see a question like, why did Jesus have to die? They don't even really process the meaning of the question. They just think, you want to hear about Jesus?
Through the incarnation and Jesus' sacrifice, God actually created a brand new kind of life. One that has virtues like courage, faith, and love.
Qualities that no human had before the incarnation of Jesus. Fuck you, past humans.
The kind of stuff that we need in this messy, unpredictable human existence.
Oh, so you mean traits that have survival utility? Yeah, that'd be why people had basic human personality traits like these and others before Jesus, too. And yes, I include faith in that too, certainly in the non-religious sense of confidence or loyalty, but even to an extent in the superstitious religious sense, because I think in some circumstances, especially in the distant past, there has been some degree of survival utility to superstitious thinking, religious thinking. So for that reason, these things have always been with us. These things are really deeply ingrained into the human mind. But no, apparently they were invented 2,000 years ago. Well, at the very least, it's nice that you acknowledge that there is utility in these. Some religious people seem to find it hard to even consider that there might be a way to decide that these are useful things without being ordered to first by God, or implanted with that idea by God. So you're doing better than some, but I'm confused in that case why you turn around and say that Jesus had to invent them.
Courage, for example, isn't real unless you're staring down fear.
Well, it's not being utilized or demonstrated unless you are, but I guess it depends on how you define courage. It sounds sounds like you're referring to the display itself. Courage is you showing that you can resist fear. And if that's the case, then sure, I guess it would only be a thing when you're in the process of staring down fear, as you say. But it's kind of a weird definition to me. I would define it more as the capacity to do that, which can be latent in a person even if it's never put into practical use. And in that case, the courage is there in the person as a trait, regardless of whether the scary event actually occurs or not. That makes more sense to me, but it doesn't really bother me either way. If you want to use it your way, you can, I suppose.
The same goes for faith. You can't trust unless you have the temptation to doubt.
Wait, what? Why? A temptation to doubt is a lack of trust, at least to some degree. That little voice in the back of your head saying this person might be wrong, this person might act unpredictably, this person might lie. If you fully trust someone in a given situation, then that temptation is not going to occur to you, because that temptation is like the opposite of trust. Now that's if you fully trust someone. Of course, you don't always fully trust someone. I'm just saying that trust in the absence of distrust or the temptation to distrust is not some logical impossibility. If someone had only trust and no temptation to distrust someone else, you would never say, oh, therefore you don't trust that person. That's absurd. Thinking someone's going to act one way is not dependent for its very reality on you also being tempted to think they won't act that way. What an interesting way to phrase it, by the way, the temptation to doubt. Like as if doubting someone is something you do just because you really, really want to, and when you don't doubt someone, it's because you're actively resisting the temptation to do so. Like you're resisting the temptation to eat a chocolate bar. Yeah, I don't think that's how that works.
In love, real love means risking yourself and being vulnerable.
No. If you're a stoic person, and you don't break down into tears every 10 minutes and piss and whine about your feelings, and how vulnerable you are, that doesn't mean the feeling of affection that is love is not occurring in your brain. Feelings currently ongoing inside you are not condemned to unreality because you're not a soft boy. Please. Now, you could say, no, I'm not talking about that. What I mean is putting yourself out there. You have to take a risk to say, look, I love you, and this is super scary to do, and I feel so vulnerable about it, but will you go steady with me? But then if anything, you're not talking about love, you're talking about courage. Risking yourself, being vulnerable. This is facing fear that you're talking about. You can be deeply in love with someone and scared as hell. Too scared to show it. The way you've defined it, though, that's simply not possible. Until you show courage and take the risk, you're by definition not in love? What?
God, in all of his glory, knew all about fear and doubt, but he couldn't experience it without becoming one of us.
Oh, so he did know about it. He knew all about it, as you say, which literally means in this case, he knew literally everything about it. God knows every true thing, right? God's omniscient, right? Great, so whether he experienced it or not, he knew exactly what it was like in every detail for every person. So what good did experiencing it do? Did it change his mind that already had all the details on exactly what it was like to experience it? He actually came down and went, oh man, I had no idea, except I did, though. This is complete gibberish, man. Did you listen to any of this after you said it?
And without experiencing it, he couldn't offer us a way to overcome it.
Why? He's all-powerful! Yes, he could have! What are you talking about?
That's why Jesus' death is so key.
That's why Jesus had to die. Because a bunch of random crap that makes no sense when you put it together. Well, heck, I guess I'm convinced.
In the Passion, Jesus faced fear, injustice, and even alienation from God. He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Yeah, so God kind of like turned off the omniscience switch in the Jesus body thing. Is that even a thing he can do? I thought that was like baked into his nature. Did he have to fake it? Just kind of pretend he didn't know the answer already?
And yet, he still acted with perfect love and faith. In doing so, Jesus made those virtues alive in God's life.
Alive in God's life? So then it's not just that we didn't have love and faith before Jesus, it's that God didn't. He hadn't felt how crappy it is to be a human alien. And then once he did, he was like, wow, I need some of this love and faith stuff in my life. This stuff I just invented right now that never existed previously. That's the stuff. But if this wasn't a thing before, how did Jesus do it? If love and faith were previously non-existent or dead in God's life, and it took the sacrifice of Jesus to bring them alive in God's life, and we humans didn't have them either before the sacrifice, then how did God in human form even do it? Where'd those traits come from if God didn't have them and we didn't have them? That's putting the cart before the horse.
Think of it like a blood transfusion. When we're connected to Christ, it's like getting a transfusion of divine life.
Okay, but you just said God got the transfusion. God's life got love and faith awakened in it. Now you're talking about us getting something out of it. This has nothing to do with us. This is God's issue with himself, apparently. At least by the way you said it.
His blood is the antidote to sin.
The antidote to whose sin? God's? You said this whole thing is about putting virtues into God's life. That would imply that we're fixing God's sin with the transfusion from Jesus, right? Or is it possible, and call me crazy, but I think this just might be possible, are you just speaking in religious gibberish catchphrases that don't actually mean much of anything or relate to your point in any useful way without really thinking about it? And therefore you end up sounding ridiculous to anyone who's not just nodding along uncritically without listening to what you actually said. Hey, it's a possibility at least.
And yeah, it's graphic, but Jesus says it himself in John 6. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you.
Yeah, okay, whatever. So what was this whole thing about God becoming Jesus so he could, experience what it's like to be us and understand us better? How does that play into all this? Did God role-playing Jesus to understand us better make the Jesus blood turn into love and faith juice somehow? What do these things have to do with each other? What is the mechanism here? How does one affect the other? And really, regardless of what the answer is, why did God set it up that way? This is a very, very specific arrangement, and there's seemingly no particular reason why it would have to be specifically this way if it's under the control of literally God. Why was God constrained to this? Why do you portray your limitless God as being so small and limited? If he wanted to understand what it's like to be a person, he could have just done that, and frankly, it seems like he already did even before Jesus. If the understanding itself really wasn't the point, but the point was to make Jesus blood that you could then transfuse into a person to give them the upgraded God Life 2.0, then you could have just skipped the middleman, made the blood, transfused it into the people, and been done with it. Nothing about the actual, physical, in the real world sacrifice of Jesus seems to have any actual importance to this when we're talking about an all-knowing, all-powerful God. If anything, it seems like that part was just put on to entertain us. How can you make this make sense as something that a God with the properties you believe he has was obligated to do to achieve his goals? Thus far, it seems as if you've ignored the topic entirely, and maybe you don't even understand what the question is.
Translation, you want life? You need to fully partake in his.
Okay, why? Well, of course, if God's all-powerful, the answer can only be just because he feels like it. Any of these random shenanigans that God insists you participate in could have been any other random shenanigans, or they could have been no shenanigans at all, and worked just as well. There are no limits here. God is not constrained by logic to do it this way, even if God is in fact constrained by logic. There's no logical requirement for any of this, or at least none that you've presented. You haven't even brought that up as a relevant factor, when that's the only factor that would matter.
That's why we celebrate the Eucharist.
What, to LARP like you're eating Jesus?
When Jesus said, "This is my body, this is my blood,"
this is for fighting, this is for fun,
he wasn't just being poetic.
It kind of sounds like he was. I don't think he literally meant, bleed me out and turn me into bacon and black pudding. Or pretend that wine and crackers are an exercise in cannibalism. I know you want to take this literally, but just because you claim that it's to be taken literally doesn't make it sound any less metaphorical.
He was inviting us to participate in his life. By partaking, we're sharing in the divine, self-sacrificial love that defeated sin and death.
Okay, and what does that have to do with eating the crackers that transubstantiate imperceptibly into meat in your mouth? Is that like a literal Jesus transfusion? It's your weekly medicine that you have to take or you lose love and courage and faith? You know you can't take a transfusion orally, right? And you don't do it by eating meat? I know most of you guys don't drink the wine. The priests do that. Wine's expensive, bro. Listen, if I'm gonna do this transfusion thing, I want to do it right. I'm gonna find myself a bag of Jesus blood on a rubber tube.
And it's not just about the cup. Baptism is also how we share in Jesus' death and resurrection. When we're baptized...
So now you're just going on about why you do these different rituals and stuff. So you're acting like the main point is already settled. Why Jesus had to die, despite the fact that you haven't even tried to address it yet. You're just talking about a bunch of other stuff, distracting from the point without ever mentioning the actual point. Sorry, but I'm skipping your whole explanation of why you think baptism matters. It has nothing to do with anything.
So what about the role of sacrifices in the Old Testament?
Are you kidding me with this? So we're just done with the actual topic then, before we've even started. We're just addressing random disconnected points of theology now.
Were they just some sort of bloody mess? No, rather they were a foreshadowing.
Okay, so they weren't just a bloody mess, they were also foreshadowing. Wait, so God spent like 1,000 years insisting that people make bloody messes to foreshadow his incarnation instead of just doing it? He knew it had to be done, but he was real flexible on time frame.
The lamb represented Jesus.
Okay, what about the goats? Cattle, doves, pigeons, adult sheep. Who did all those represent? And what about the foreskins? Did those sacrifices represent somebody? Man, imagine if that was the metaphor for Jesus instead. They'd all have to try not to giggle when they bring it up in church. But that's not a sacrifice in the same way as the lamb. Shut up. Anyway, there's nothing left of any value in this video, so thanks for watching. If you would, before you go, please do give the video a like and click subscribe if you haven't, and if you like the channel, maybe consider supporting. A couple of bucks per video or per month is enormously helpful, and huge thanks to all of my supporters who've already made that choice. Join the Discord, and I'll see you next time.